We'll have to see. Okay, so another function of the respiratory system is thermoregulation. So it's also involved in making sure that your body temperature stays at a good place. So in terms of the homeostasis. Again, can you guys hear me again now that I got disconnected and reconnected? Okay, cool. And it's still recording. All right, good. So in the lungs, the oxygen is going to be diffusing into the blood, and carbon dioxide is going to be diffusing out. So that's the gas exchange portion of the respiratory system. And also, the mechanism of this gas exchange, it follows something called Henry's law. And what that basically says is that there's an equilibrium concentration of oxygen that should be dissolved in the blood, and your respiratory system tries to make it so that we maintain this equilibrium of oxygen in the blood. And when the blood actually reaches the lungs, it has less than the equilibrium concentration of blood, because this is deoxygenated blood, and the capillaries take up oxygen. Capillaries that are around the alveoli, they take up the oxygen in order to get back to the equilibrium concentration. So that's called Henry's law. In terms of the thermoregulation, breathing itself, it actually causes you to lose heat. So in that way, you're regulating the temperature of your body. In fact, one interesting thing is, like with dogs, since they don't sweat, pretty much all of their thermoregulation, it comes from the respiratory system. That's why when they get really hot, they start panting. Another function of the respiratory system is also protection against disease. So it does have a little bit to do with the it's a component of the immune system as well, because the nostril hairs, they actually filter out particles, and also the mucus lining of the respiratory tract, it helps trap pathogens and particles. So this is more the non-distinct, the non-special part of the, or non-specific part of the immune system. And also cilia that's on the lining of the respiratory tract, it actually sweeps pathogens and particles out. So you end up like either spitting it out or swallowing it into the stomach acid, which kills them. And also there's another just interesting thing. There's a lot of macrophages that actually reside in the alveoli, because you are breathing in germs all the time. And when these pathogens come in, the macrophages can take care of them. Now let's look at this this PowerPoint. So we have the nose, which is, and all of the little, I've already uploaded the PowerPoints, by the way, for this one and the next one we're going to go over. The nose is obviously the passageway for air, and the air then goes, it also can come in through the mouth as well. The epiglottis, we talked about it yesterday. It's just a little flap of cartilage that covers up the trachea when you're eating food, so that you don't end up having food go down your windpipe instead of through your esophagus. The nasal cavity, it filters, warms, and moistens air. The pharynx, this is the common passageway for air, food, and liquid. So this is the part which is technically a part of your respiratory and digestive system, but it gets differentiated over here by the larynx, because the epiglottis is dividing it up there. So the larynx, which is also known as the voice box, it produces sound. And the larynx eventually comes down to, pull up my pointer, comes down to the trachea, or the windpipe, and this is the main airway of the respiratory system. And that eventually breaks it up over here and goes to your two lungs. So with your lungs, the lung is obviously the important organ of gas exchange. And other parts that are important in that is your intercostal muscles, because those are going to be moving your ribs during each breath that you take in. So that allows the lungs to expand. The pleural membrane are the membranes that cover the lungs and chest cavity. So it's just this part right over here between the intercostal muscles and ribs, and then the lungs. And then the diaphragm is the skeletal muscle. It's basically a flap of skeletal muscle that goes underneath, and that helps with respiration. So when you breathe in, it's going to contract, and it increases the chest volume.
A moment.
Your trachea breaks into your bronchi, which is this part right over here, and those are just the branching airways. And those eventually become tiny, tiny little cells. Well, not cells, but tiny little air sacs called alveoli. And that's where the gas exchange is actually happening, because the alveoli are surrounded by capillaries. Now we're just going to skip that slide. Oh, one other function that we didn't really say so much is also there's receptors for smell and also resonating chambers for your voice. Those are other functions that are part of the upper respiratory tract. And the upper respiratory tract, it's this part right here. So all the way down to your trachea. And everything underneath that is called the lower respiratory tract. Any questions so far? Nope. Okay. So now this is the lower respiratory tract. Now this is where the larynx becomes the trachea, and then the trachea becomes the bronchus, and then the bronchioles. So the bronchi and the bronchioles, it breaks down into bronchi are bigger than bronchioles. Bronchioles are when it's kind of like when you go from arteries to arterioles, except with your respiratory system, it's the bronchi and bronchioles. And also your alveoli are part of the lower respiratory tract as well. Okay, so each of the specific things, let's look at the functions of them. So the larynx, this is going to be maintaining an open airway, and it routes food and air appropriately through the use of the epiglottis, and it also assists in sound production. Your trachea, it transports, or your trachea or your windpipe, it transports air to and from the lungs. And your bronchi branch into the lungs, and your lungs are transporting air to alveoli for exchange. This is each of the parts of the lower respiratory tract. Here's just a picture of how the alveoli look. So the gas exchange is occurring right over here. You can see that all of these vessels, remember it from the circulatory system that your pulmonary artery is going to be branching off from the heart to the lungs, and it's going to be filled with deoxygenated blood. And these arteries eventually become arterioles, which eventually become capillaries. And then the capillaries are the ones right over here, which are surrounding the alveoli. And it's coming over here, so it's all deoxygenated. And at the alveoli, they're going to be taking up oxygen, and the blood will then be reoxygenated and then travel back through these capillaries, become venules, and then become the pulmonary vein, and then come back to the heart and eventually get pumped out to the rest of the body through the aorta. And you can see right over here that it's interesting because these capillaries, they're only one cell thick, so oxygen, carbon dioxide, they can exchange pretty easily through there. So the oxygen is going from the alveoli into the blood, whereas the carbon dioxide is leaving the blood into the alveoli and out through the mouth. So just a definition of the alveoli, they're moist, thin-walled pockets, which are the site of gas exchange. Also in the alveoli, there's a slightly oily surfactant that prevents the alveolar walls from collapsing and sticking together. Okay, now circulation and gas exchange. The concept of I guess the gas exchange actually happening, like all of the mechanisms of it, that's kind of the key component of the respiratory system for the MCAT. Before we even go into this, I want to talk a little bit about like the diaphragm and rib cage and the differential pressure that's involved. I'm not actually sure if this PowerPoint has slides about that. Let's see. It goes into a little basics about it, but let me kind of go over it first, and then we'll go over the slides, and hopefully that'll just rehash it. So your diaphragm, obviously, it's that muscle that's right beneath the lungs. It's separating that upper part of your body from the lower part, and it's the muscle. What it does is it kind of pulls downward when contracting, and that increases chest volume. So when it contracts, you're actually taking air in, and it increases the chest volume. And by increasing the chest volume, what happens is it decreases the pressure. So since the volume is greater now, there's a lower pressure there. And if there's it eventually gets to a point where there's lower pressure than there is outside the pressure, like the atmospheric pressure. So because of that gradient, it pretty much sucks air into your lungs. So the diaphragm is very, very important in terms of the respiratory system and breathing. During all of that, the rib cage, it actually also expands outwards. So the intercostal muscles, they help this expansion. And normally at rest, the rib cage it maintains lung volume and it prevents the lungs from collapsing as well. So that's another function of the rib cage, and it also, it also protects the lungs physically as well. Now, in terms of the pressure, I think this is kind of one of I don't know. For me, when I was studying for the MCAT, it was a little bit harder to understand, but once I understood it, kind of all made sense. So there's two different types of pressure involved. So write this down because this isn't on the slides or anything. You have intrapulmonary pressure, and you have intrapleural pressure. Let me type those out for you. And I'll even put a little so intrapulmonary pressure, what that basically is atmospheric pressure. So the lungs themselves, they're actually open to the outside. So the intrapulmonary pressure is the pressure inside your lungs. Since your lungs are eventually open to the outside, the pressure in them is actually going to be the same pressure as outside, so the same as the atmospheric pressure. Whereas the intrapleural pressure, this is going to be the pressure of the pleural cavity. So it's that place between the lungs and the ribs and the diaphragm, and this is going to be less than atmospheric pressure. So when you take in a breath, the intrapleural pressure, it decreases even further because you're going to be expanding that volume. So that causes the lungs to expand because the air is traveling from the outside into your lungs. Does that make sense? It's kind of it's a pretty key concept here. It's basically a negative pressure mechanism, and all that is just like when you inhale, your lungs open up, and it's because of the pressure gradient. Because when you inhale, you're opening up this whole area, and there's going to be more volume there. So because of that pressure difference, the air fills up your lungs. When I was explaining. Hey guys, I'm back. Kick me off one more time. Did you guys get all the stuff about the pressure difference? Let me know if I was cut off before I fully explained it. Yeah, what's up, Moment?
So, whenever intrapulmonary pressure is more, lung expands. When it's less, it contracts. Right?
Yeah, so the lungs, they're not actually contracting. So the intrapulmonary pressure is always going to be greater than the intrapleural pressure, but based on that difference, when the intrapleural pressure gets even lower, that's when the air enters the lungs. That's why there's always going to be air in your lungs because the intrapleural pressure is always going to be a little bit less than the atmospheric pressure or intrapulmonary pressure. Does that make sense? You can unmic your mute and just talk again too.
Thank you.
Does that make sense? Say yeah. I think that was a yes. Cool. Now, circulation and gas exchange. We kind of went over this when I was showing you the picture of the alveolus, but because of this is where the interconnection between the circulatory and respiratory system comes into play, because obviously your blood is going to be traveling through these capillaries right up here around the alveolus. So because of that, oxygen and carbon dioxide are being exchanged here just simply through passive diffusion. And the gases they end up being dissolved in the blood, and they're transported by the circulatory system. And eventually they're exchanged in the tissue as well. So in all the muscles, when your veins are taking the oxygen there. The oxygen leaves your capillaries, goes to the muscles, which need the oxygen, and whatever the carbon dioxide waste products that the muscles have, it comes back into the blood and comes back to the lungs where they're exhaled. So in the blood, tell me what the oxygen is bound to. What specifically within what cell? Yeah, the hemoglobin in the red blood cells. So we can also instead of just typing in the chat box, we can also do it like Dr. Sutton does. If you just raise your hand, I'll click on your name, and then you can speak. So let me enable microphones on all these. That'll probably make it a little bit more interesting instead of me talking to the chat box. And could you guys mute your microphones right now so while I'm talking? And once you raise your hands, you can unmute it. All right. So, okay, yeah, this we've kind of already gone over this, and obviously, it makes sense that air that's entering the lungs, it contains more oxygen and less carbon dioxide in the blood, because the blood has all of the deoxygenated blood, which has higher levels of carbon dioxide. So, somebody raise their hand and tell me, how do these differences in gas concentrations assist gas exchange? All right, no one's going to raise their hand. So it's because of different gradients. So whenever there's a concentration gradient, stuff is going to move from a high concentration to a low concentration, right? That's just a simple concept of a gradient, and that's the same in terms of like chemical gradients, electrical gradients, pretty much any type of gradients. Everything is going to move from high to low. So when there's high carbon dioxide in the blood, it's going to want to go somewhere with low concentration, which is into the alveoli, because the air that's coming in from outside, it has, yeah. Go ahead, Moen. What were you going to say?
Is it true that when there's too much carbon dioxide, the body also converts it to carbonic acid?
I'm actually not sure. I have to look that up. But I think for the purposes of the MCAT, it's not going to go into that kind of detail. And if it does go into that kind of detail, it'll be in a passage which actually gives you that information. But, just for your own sake, I would just suggest that you look it up. But in terms of these gradients, that's why carbon dioxide is going to be leaving the blood into the alveoli and then out the body when you exhale. And oxygen is going to be going from a highly concentrated area, which is the air that's coming in, into the blood, which has low oxygen concentration, so that you're oxygenating the blood. So, like y'all answered, oxygen transport, that it diffuses here through a single cellular thick capillary wall. It's carried into the tissues, and it ends up binding to the hemoglobin in the red blood cells, and it eventually diffuses through the tissue capillary walls into the body. What are some advantages to using hemoglobin to transport oxygen? I'm not going to ask that question. Okay, so carbon dioxide, it can dissolve in plasma, and about 70% of it, which is, majority of it, is going to be forming bicarbonate ions. And some carbon dioxide can also bind to hemoglobin for transport, but not very much of it. And just like the oxygen, it diffuses through the lung capillary wall, which is one cell thick. It's carried into the lungs, and it diffuses through tissue capillary walls. Oh, sorry, it goes the other way around. Tissue capillary walls, then lungs, then capillary walls. Okay, so here's a picture of what I was talking about with the diaphragm. So the diaphragm right here in a relaxed state, it's going to be making the lung, or not the lung capacity, this interpleural space capacity low. When you take in air, the ribs move outward and upward and outward due to muscle contraction, and the lung volume increases, causing air pressure to fall. So the diaphragm also contracts and flattens, moving downward. When you're expiring, which is exhaling, air flows out because the diaphragm relaxes, the lung volume decreases, causing air pressure to rise, and the ribs, they return to resting position. And as a result, the air flows out. Now, here's just a measurement of lung capacity. This part is not going to be on the MCAT, but it might show up in a passage. I mean, you're not required to know it, but it may show up in a passage, and it'll be helpful to have a little bit of background on it. So these different residual volume is the amount of air that's always going to be in your lung, even when you exhale all the way. So I think the definition is when you exhale everything, as much air out as possible, there's still going to be air left in your lungs. That's the residual volume. The tidal volume, that's going to be like your normal in and out of air. If you take in a deep breath, as much air as you can possibly take, that's going to show you your inspiratory reserve. And if you exhale as much as you can do, it's going to be your expiratory reserve. And the difference, the total amount from the top of the inspiratory reserve to the bottom of the expiratory, that's going to be your vital capacity. That's the maximum amount of air you can actually control in and out of your lungs. Okay, so your regulation of the breathing, it's done through your medulla oblongata, which is a part of your nervous system. It's part of your brain. It's part of that brain stem. In the medulla oblongata, there's something called a respiratory center, and that established the regular path of breathing. There's receptor cells near the respiratory center that respond to changes in cerebrospinal fluid hydrogen, like proton concentration, and that's caused by increases in arterial CO2 levels. So when that happens, the respiratory cells in the carotid and aortic bodies respond to large decreases in arterial oxygen. And there's also these are all like different places where it's regulated, my bad. So these are 3 different ways. And there's also higher centers in the cortex that exert conscious control over respiration. This part's a little bit confusing. You don't really need to know this part that much for the MCAT. Okay, so just a couple of disorders of respiratory system we'll look at. So a few ones that have to deal with the reduced airflow are asthma, emphysema, and bronchitis. Different infections include pneumonia, tuberculosis, and botulism. Another disorder of the respiratory system, lung cancer. Also congestive heart failure, because that's going to be affecting the pulmonary system, the pulmonary circuit of the circulatory system, which is going to be very, very tied to the respiratory system, and also cystic fibrosis. Okay, and here I already went over the pressure gradient, but I guess we can look at it one more time. But inspiration means air in, expiration means air out, and the cycle, relaxed state. In a relaxed state, your diaphragm and your intercostal muscles are relaxed. When you have an inspiration, the diaphragm contracts, it pulls the muscle downward. Intercostal muscles contract, elevating the chest wall and expanding the volume of the chest. And that lowers the pressure in the lungs and pulls in air. When you're expiring or releasing air, the muscles relax, the diaphragm resumes that dome shape that it normally has, and then the intercostal muscles allow the chest to lower, resulting in an increase of pressure in the chest and expulsion. Okay, we already went over this stuff. I feel like some of these slides, it's a little bit repetitive. We've also been all over all of these bullet points as well. And this. Sorry guys, I have very repetitive slides here. Okay, and we'll just, I guess, sum it all up with these 4 respiration processes, or sum up the respiratory system. And since we're going over 3 different systems, it's probably better that we've gotten through the respiratory system in 30 minutes. Breathing is air into and out of lungs. External respiration is the gas exchange between the air and the blood. Internal respiration is the gas exchange between the blood and the tissues. Cellular respiration is when oxygen is actually used to produce ATP or energy, and then carbon dioxide is made as a waste. Okay, so let's take a break here, and then even though it's been only 30 minutes, and we'll be back at 6:40, and we'll go over the excretory system and the reproductive system. And go ahead and set your status to away. Step.
Hey, bro. What up?
Danish, were you going to say something? Okay. Well, yeah, we'll come back and do the excretory and reproductive system.